Hi, in this video I'm going to be talking about the four big validities. This is how your book refers to four ways that we can ask about whether a conclusion from a study is valid. So what does valid mean? Valid in a really general or abstract sense means reasonable, accurate, and justifiable. But it's not enough to say that a claim is just valid or invalid. There are lots of ways that a claim has to be valid or could be invalid. There are different aspects to claims. There are different kinds of evidence we need to look for. And so valid is too broad of a concept to encompass everything. This idea of four different kinds of validity or four different components of validity comes from a researcher named Donald Campbell and another one, Julian Stanley. They wrote a book about this in the 1950s. It's been updated many times over the years. It's still around. And so this idea of looking at four different ways of thinking about validity or looking at validity has been around psychology and other behavioral sciences for a long time. So I'm going to go through the four big validities today. And as I said in an earlier video, this week is kind of an overview. We're going to spend a lot of time on all of these later in the course. The first of these four validities that I want to talk about is something called construct validity. Now, you might remember the word construct coming up in an earlier video. Construct means conceptual variable. A construct is a variable that exists in our theories. It's an abstraction. So when we evaluate construct validity, we're evaluating the extent to which the operationalization, meaning the procedure that we use to measure something, actually corresponds to the construct, the concept that we say it's about. So you can think of this as asking, how well did the researchers measure what they were interested in measuring? Evaluating construct validity involves theories and evidence, like everything else in science. So even though measurement might sound kind of dry and boring, measurement is where the rubber hits the road. Measurement is about theories and evidence, like everything else in science. Okay, so how do we interrogate construct validity? Well, let me give you an example and talk about how we might start to think about it. Suppose a researcher is interested in a construct of attention. They want to know how much attention are people paying. And let's say the operationalization is a self-report questionnaire where they measure attention by asking people how much they agree with the statement, "I paid close attention in class." So if we're interrogating the construct validity, we're asking how well does this procedure, a self-report questionnaire, measure the construct attention? We might start asking ourselves questions like, well, is paying attention something people really can know about themselves? If you're not paying attention, do you know you're not paying attention? Or is that kind of circular because you're not paying attention? And if people did know it, would they report it accurately? Would they tell us I wasn't paying attention in class? Or might they feel like they need to cover up? So these are good questions to ask. And honestly, I don't know the answers to both of these. It might depend on different settings. I think sometimes people know something about themselves and they're usually willing to be at least somewhat honest. But if we don't know the answers to this, we would do a study to try and find out. So as I said, construct validity is about theories and evidence. These are hypotheses. We can go do a study and we can try to test them to see, can people accurately report their attention? Is it something they're willing to admit to? If so, then we have evidence that this is a good method. If not, then we have evidence that it's not. So that's construct validity. Second kind of validity I want to talk about is external validity. Evaluating external validity involves assessing how well the results represent or generalize to other people or contexts outside of the study that we might want to draw inferences about. Now that last part is kind of important because sometimes studies are trying to draw inferences very broadly about lots and lots of different people and different settings. Other times they're very specific. So we want to ask ourselves, well, what is the claim saying about generalizability? And then we want to ask, how well does it support it? How much evidence do we have for that? So for example, a lot of research studies are done on college students, but the claims are made about how people work in general. And so we might ask, well, how well does a study of college students represent how all different kinds of people of different ages, different cultural settings, different education levels, etc., how well does a college student sample represent how all those different kinds of people in general think, feel, and behave? That might be really good for some things and really bad for others. Our visual systems might be pretty similar around the world. Our attitudes and beliefs might be different. So in some settings we might be comfortable, in some settings we might be not. Another kind of external validity, that first one was about the people, generalizing to people. The second one is about generalizing to context or settings. So we might do a study in a laboratory, and then we might want to generalize about how things work out in the world outside of our laboratory. So we could ask, how well does a study done in a lab represent things that happen in daily life? So a couple examples to work through. Imagine you see a study and you're reading the methods section. It says this study was done with the University of Oregon students. So you could ask, how appropriate would a sample of U of O students be for different kinds of claims? So suppose somebody is saying, I did a survey and this is approval of the ASUO president. How appropriate would that be? Probably pretty appropriate, since we're only probably trying to generalize to U of O students anyway. How appropriate would it be to study attitudes about Brexit? Well, Brexit is something that's happening in Great Britain. U of O students might not be thinking about it very much. They might not be the right people to be asking because they're not the ones who voted on it, who are having to live with the consequences of it, etc. So it might be less of an appropriate sample. What about a study measuring the association between working memory and intelligence? Well, this one's a little bit more ambiguous. U of O students are selected on academic performance, but these are things that maybe the association does generalize. So we'd want to ask ourselves these questions and maybe look for evidence that would help us decide whether we can generalize or not. The third kind of validity I'm going to talk about is statistical validity, or sometimes this is also called statistical conclusion validity. And this is when we evaluate how accurate and reasonable the statistics are and the inferences that we're drawing from them. Now, this is a big topic. If you go on in the psychology major, the next class you take will be statistics in psychology. You can go on, you can study statistics forever, you can major in statistics, you can have a whole career in statistics, you can never reach the end of studying statistics. But we're going to introduce a few general concepts from statistics in this class a little bit later. I want to give you a sort of first pass at some of the kinds of questions we might be asking. So one question we might ask is about precision. How precise is the answer that our statistics are giving us? So for example, in frequency claims, sometimes when you see a survey, they'll report something called the margin of error. This is based on the methods of the survey, especially the sample size, and how precise or imprecise of an answer does it give us. So if you go back to an earlier video where we had a congressional approval poll and it said 22% of Americans approve of Congress, well, that might be 22% plus or minus 2. That might be 22% plus or minus 10. That would be the margin of error. We also might ask for some kinds of claims. Suppose we have an association claim about the relationship between two variables. We might ask, well, how strong is this association? Or let's say we have a causal claim. How much does this affect the outcome? This is sometimes called the effect size. It's the magnitude of the effect. And then another really important topic in statistics would be whether something is statistically significant. You're going to hear this term a lot, some in this course. You'll hear it a lot as you go on and study more psychology. I'm going to get into this later, what statistically significant means. It's a complicated topic. A lot of people who are even experts don't really have their heads wrapped around it. It's a pretty challenging topic. We'll get into it later in the term. The fourth kind of validity I want to talk about is one I alluded to or started to talk about in the previous video when I talked about causal claims. This is internal validity. When we evaluate internal validity, we're assessing whether one variable caused another variable in our experiment. So remember the terminology warning I had earlier that sometimes your book uses internal validity just for one of the criteria. Sometimes it uses it for the whole shebang. This is the whole shebang. We're saying internal validity is about whether we can conclude that one variable caused another. Internal validity is not relevant to frequency or association claims because those claims aren't about cause and effect. So if someone's only making a frequency claim or an association claim, we don't have to evaluate the internal validity because it's not relevant. But it is very relevant to causal claims. If someone's saying something caused something else, then we want to evaluate its internal validity because inferring causation is very challenging. It takes a lot of evidence, different kinds of evidence. So let me walk through another example. I know I did this earlier. I talked about this a little bit in an earlier video. Let me walk through another example with a little bit more detail so you can get some sense of how we would approach this. So suppose somebody makes the claim that chewing gum improves your focus. When you chew gum, you're better able to focus on your schoolwork or whatever task you're working on. So remember those 3 criteria I talked about. The first is we want to know, is there covariance or an association between the 2 variables? So the variables are whether or not you're chewing gum and how well you're focusing. And so we might do a study and we might look at the results of that study. And let's say that we've measured how well people are focusing on a scale from 1 to 10, and we compare people who are chewing gum to people who are not chewing gum, and this is what our data looks like. This suggests there's a covariance or an association. The people who chewed gum were focusing more than the people who weren't. Now, if this was only an association claim, we would stop here. But since this is a causal claim, we have to go on and say, okay, we've got one of those 3 criteria checked off. What about the other 2? So the second one was temporal precedence. We want to know whether the gum chewing happened before the improvement in focus. How might we do this? Well, in designing a study, we might ask people to chew gum first and then measure focus afterwards. This would be a way of establishing temporal precedence. However, it's tricky if this is the only thing we do, because maybe people who are really good at focusing are likely to chew gum, and maybe we only measured focus afterwards, but that doesn't mean that they weren't good at focusing beforehand. So this can be tricky because the timing of our measurements doesn't always correspond to the time when something happened. But ideally, if we could, we'd want to establish that the cause happened before the effect. This is an important criterion for establishing cause and effect. Now, what about the third criterion, isolation, or sometimes your book calls this one internal validity? This is the idea that we can rule out other possible explanations for this pattern in the data. So we have an association, gum or no gum. We think that people's gum chewing happened before their increase in focus, and we want to rule out other alternative explanations, like maybe your personality is correlated with how much you like to chew gum, and the same parts of personality are correlated with how well people focus. We'd want to rule that out. How can we do that? Well, one very powerful technique that researchers have to do this in controlled settings is experimental manipulation. So we would, instead of just measuring, are you chewing gum or not, or do you like to chew gum or not, we would experimentally manipulate. We'd make gum chewing a manipulated variable in the study. So the experimenter would assign people to chew gum or not. And importantly, they would want to do this randomly. They do something called random assignment to assign participants to different conditions. So if the variable is gum chewing, the levels are chewed gum or didn't chew gum, and it's a manipulated variable, so the experimenter is taking control in determining who chews gum and who doesn't. If they do this randomly, they toss a coin when somebody comes into the lab. If it comes up heads, you chew some gum and do the focus task. If it comes up tails, the next person, you don't chew gum and do the focus task. This will help ensure that third variables, these other kinds of causes that we want to rule out, like maybe stressed out people like to chew gum, but they're worse at focusing. Maybe people who drink a lot of coffee like to chew gum to clear their breath, and they're better at focusing because they had the coffee. These would be balanced out across the conditions, so they couldn't account for this pattern in the data. So randomized experiments can be really powerful in supporting causal claims. So in an experiment, and we'll get into this a lot more later in the course, but this is kind of your introduction to some of these concepts. In an experiment, at least one variable is manipulated by the experimenter, and at least one variable is measured. So in this case, the manipulated variable is gum chewing. We would call this the independent variable. Because it's independent of other things. We've assigned it. It's not determined by things in the experiment. The measured variable in this case, we'd call the dependent variable, because we're trying to see whether it's dependent on our manipulation. This would be, in this example, task focus. Now, if we do this, we randomly assign some people to chew gum, some people not, and then we measure their task focus after we've randomly assigned them. Then we can see whether there's a difference between the groups. That would establish covariation or association. We know that we manipulated the causal variable before we measured the outcome. And so we know that we've established that second criterion of temporal precedence. And now, if we hadn't manipulated it, we might be worried, well, what if all the anxious people in the sample ended up in the no gum condition, not in the gum chewing, because anxious people were choosing to chew gum? Anxiety would be confounded with gum chewing. It would be an explanation we hadn't ruled out. So it would be an invalid claim, blah, blah, blah. This would be bad. So the solution of random assignment helps us rule this out. If we flipped a coin for each participant, assign them to the corresponding condition, makes it very unlikely that another variable will be confounded with our experimental variable because everything else is randomly distributed across conditions. Some of the anxious people end up in the gum condition, some in the no gum condition, because we've randomly assigned them. Okay, that wraps it up for this video. Don't forget to do the concept check questions, and I'll see you next time.